folks, me again, back with another video. Apologise, I haven't done a video for a while, so this is a bit of an update to the channel. This video is going to be about finding your own anxiolytic drugs, finding your own anxiolytic herbs. This is going to focus on plants, on herbs, and it's going to talk about, so I'm going to talk about why plants are useful as anxiolytics, why they help reduce anxiety, and how you can actually look at various herbs and decide for yourself whether they are going to be a useful treatment. Now, the first thing to say is that the scientific literature is replete with studies that look at various chemicals from plants and various herbs to see if they have anxiolytic properties. There are many of these studies that have looked at many different plants, and the vast majority of them show that plants generally have these anxiolytic effects. They're able to reduce anxiety. Now, many of these studies are done using animal models, but there are some that are done using humans. It really depends on the effectiveness of the compound. Those that are more effective and those that are perhaps more traditionally used, more widespread, more available, tends to also be used in human studies. But the vast majority of the studies have been done on animals, but they are these models that they use in animals are very well tested, and they are reasonably reliable, and so they can give a good indication of whether these plants have anxiolytic effects. Now, the first question is, why do plants have anxiolytic effects? Why are they able to decrease anxiety in animals and humans? This is quite well understood. There are a number of questions that need answering, but generally plants have high amounts of antioxidants, and they contain phytochemicals that act as antioxidants in humans and in animals. Now, one of the theories is that oxidative stress causes damage to the neurons in the brain, and that damage causes a disruption for the normal neurochemical processes. So if you have high amounts of antioxidants in your diet, that is able to prevent the oxidative stress, and therefore that is able to treat mood disorders, particularly anxiety. It can cause, you could widen this to talking about depression as well, but really these plants are, many of them are antidepressants as well, but there seems to be more consistency in plants that they have this anti-anxiety effect in humans and animals. So that's really what I'm talking about mostly, but let's extrapolate this. Some of these plants are also antidepressants, and the antidepressant theory of oxidative stress causing the depression is exactly the same. There's disruption to the neurons in the brain, and that disruption affects the neurochemistry of the brain. So there's chemical imbalance caused by oxidative stress. So if you take in a high plant diet, you eat lots of plants, you eat certain plants that have very high amounts of antioxidants, that may be protective of that process. However, some of the chemicals that are in plants that appear to have this anxiolytic antidepressant effect are not antioxidants, or they're not obvious antioxidants. So there may be other mechanisms as well. Certainly some of the chemicals may directly bind to particular receptors, which can help rebalance certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And also there is another mechanism whereby plants may be beneficial against development of mood disorders, because many of these plants contain compounds that can actually decrease cortisol levels and corticosterone levels in animals. Cortisol is a human version of corticosterone. Those are the stress hormones, and certain plants are able to decrease levels of those stress hormones, and that may be another way in which they are protective, because the stress hormones can cause oxidative stress, and therefore obviously that then goes through the same pathway. The oxidative stress damages the neurons, and the neurons then cause a chemical imbalance. So there's two real mechanisms there that plants may be beneficial. Now, most plants contain antioxidants. In fact, all plants contain antioxidants. All cells contain antioxidants, but certain plants are very rich in certain types of antioxidants. not all plants have this ability to reduce stress levels. So this is where you get differences in the effectiveness of certain plants. So something like ginseng, for example, ginseng contains ginsenosides, and those ginsenosides are able to decrease cortisol levels in humans, and that may be why they are protective of, why ginseng is protective of mood disorders, and certainly is an anxiolytic and an antidepressant compound. However, there are also antioxidants in ginseng, and they will, I would suggest, undoubtedly contribute towards that beneficial effect. So if you're looking for your own anxiolytic herb and you're wondering whether your the plant that you're looking at has anxiolytic effects, obviously it has to be an edible plant. I'm not suggesting you go out and just randomly eat plants. I'm talking about supplements that are available that aren't actually marketed as anxiolytic compounds. So for example, chamomile is known to have a calming effect. It's marketed as a kind of a calming anxiolytic tea, mostly available as tea, and it's widely known to have that effect. But there are herbs out there that perhaps aren't thought of in that way. Dandelion, for example, dandelion will probably have anxiolytic effects in humans. It's certainly there's certainly evidence that it does have high amounts of antioxidants, and there's certainly evidence that it does have certain effects in animals that could be construed as having, could be related to effectiveness against mood disorders. So there are plants that are available as herbs, herbal supplements that aren't actually directly marketed as anxiolytics. And the point here is that science only has a certain limited amount of resources. There are only a certain number of people doing research on these compounds. Usually scientists will not randomly screen compounds for anxiolytic properties. They do sometimes. Sometimes some studies will take a group of, a list of herbs, and it will screen them for particular properties. But generally, scientists put together these papers from reading traditional medicine, for example. So Ayurvedic medicine will have a number of herbs that are known to have anti-stress, general tonic or mood elevating effects, and by reading that literature you can get some kind of idea of the herbs that may have these effects, and it's generally those ones that are researched. So most of the herbs that have been looked at for their anxiolytic and antidepressant effects are those that are used in traditional medicine. And there's a large number of those that are researched. As if you read my blog or if you look at my videos, you can see that I've talked about many of them. But there are many other plant compounds that you might expect them to have anxiolytic effects if you look at the profiles. And what I'm suggesting is that if you start to read scientific literature, you can actually deduce for yourself whether you think certain compounds would be beneficial. The first thing to say is that a high plant diet contains lots of antioxidants. So my opinion is, and based on what I've read and looking at the evidence, that if you piece together the scientific literature, a high plant diet is an anxiolytic diet. It will reduce levels of anxiety because of the high amounts of antioxidants that you'll be consuming. Now, some of those plant compounds, some of those plants that you will consume will also have anti-stress effects, which will obviously multiply the benefits that you get from that diet. Not all of those plants in that diet will have been researched for their anxiolytic effects, but generally they will all work together, supplying high amounts of antioxidants. And that's not to say that if you are a vegetarian or you eat high amounts of plants you will be immune from mood disorders, but certainly you will be protected from developing them. So what you really need to do is start to read papers, start to read analysis of certain herbs to just have a look what phytochemicals they contain. And what we tend to find is that when we look at the types of herbs that have anxiolytic effects and certain antidepressant effects, we tend to find they have certain compounds that are common in their tissues. Flavonoids seem to be present in many of the anxiolytic herbs, and in particular the flavones are a group of flavonoids that are particularly present in anxiolytic herbs. So that's things like a pigeonin. Pigeonin is quite often found in some of these herbs, as well as chrysin. That's another flavone. And generally what you find is that if you look in the literature at some of the anxiolytic herbs that are there, you'll find those two antioxidants in them. these anxiolytic compounds also tend to contain certain alkaloids. Now, alkaloids are a double-edged sword because certain alkaloids have health effects, but other alkaloids can be toxic. And this is why I said, you don't want to just go out and randomly start eating, plants to see if they have anxiolytic effects. What I'm talking about is plants that have already been assessed for their edibility that perhaps haven't been shown to have anxiolytic effects. Just because they're not in the scientific literature doesn't mean they don't have anxiolytic effects. It just means they haven't been researched for them. So I talk to people, for example, who tell me that certain compounds have helped their anxiety, and they ask me, is there a paper that would back this up? And I look, and there isn't. Nobody's researched that particular herb. But when I look at the chemical analysis of that herb, I see the usual suspects. I see a group of alkaloids. I see the flavones, maybe some flavones in there. Quite often, terpenoids are another class of compounds that you find in these anxiolytic herbs. And they always contain these types of phytochemicals. So those are the three real groups to look for. There are some herbs, like I say, like ginseng, that have these specialized compounds like ginsenosides and other adaptogenic herbs that can actually decrease cortisol as well, but they're not really something that you would generally eat. They tend to be quite specialized compounds. I'm talking about things that you might come across quite frequently in herbal medicine for other reasons. So dandelion, for example, I've given as an example before. There's no reason to suspect that dandelion wouldn't help somebody with anxiety. It has high amounts of antioxidants in it. If you actually look at it, some of those antioxidants are flavonoids. It has high amounts of other antioxidant nutrients, and it has what we would expect as a profile for a compound that would certainly help somebody with anxiety. Now, that's not to say it will cure the anxiety, because none of these compounds generally are expected to be perfect all the time, and they don't work for everybody. But you can have a look at some of these compounds, perhaps teas that you drink, have a look at the research and see what compounds they contain, and you can make up your own mind whether you feel that they would be beneficial. And that's really what this channel is about. I'm trying to get and encourage people to become interested in nutrition so that you can make your own decisions. And this is really the process I go through when I'm looking for research to be able to talk about plants. I'm very interested in plants. I find them incredibly interesting. I find them, I'm a biologist by training, and I find them more interesting than animals. But when I'm looking for studies that can, studies to write about anxiolytic herbs, quite often the searches that I do are not actually for the herbs themselves. They're for the compounds that I would expect to find in these anxiolytic herbs. So I quite often search for apigenin with the keyword anxiety. I quite often search for chrysin, and it brings up herbs that I've sometimes never heard of before. They're used in Ayurvedic medicine. Perhaps they're only available in China, or they're available in India from traditional medicine. And those types of searches do bring up herbs that are not commonly found in the West, but appear to have these anxiolytic effects. And it got me thinking that there are many herbal remedies and herbs that are used in the West, many teas that are available which contain which are based on plant material, that aren't marketed as anxiolytic treatments, but they do contain high amounts of the compounds that you would expect to have those effects. And this brings me to the second point, really, which is many people expect the nutritional literature to contain information for them, but really the nutritional literature is limited by the resources of the researchers. There are many people with anecdotal information about certain compounds that are able to treat particular diseases, and this is how traditional medicine has been built up over many decades and centuries. It's trial and error from people who take these compounds and find that they work. And what science is actually doing is taking this anecdotal knowledge and it's transforming it into a more objective form, so that these properties can be measured. But generally the research is based on these anecdotal stories. So if you're somebody that's had experience of a compound that's given you a particular benefit, but there's nothing in the scientific literature to support that, that doesn't mean that the benefit that you got didn't exist. All it means is that science hasn't got around to asking that question and making an answer for it. And this is something I come across more and more as I talk to more people about nutrition as I go through my life. I find I learn a lot from people who have taken particular compounds for particular ailments, not just anxiety, but for other physical ailments and other health effects, and piecing together the information that you get from the nutritional literature, you quite often find that there is a good basis and some good reason why that compound could actually be beneficial. So never dismiss anecdotal evidence, particularly from yourself. And the other thing to say is that there is a placebo effect, but a placebo effect is still a positive effect. I'm a strong believer in using the placebo effect, and if you take something and it benefits you, it doesn't matter whether that effect is a perceived effect in your mind or a real effect. And the point to make about the placebo effect is that although it's often considered a mind trick, really it's not, because the placebo effect does cause a real physiological change. There have been many studies on the placebo effect, looking at how the placebo effect of inert capsules affects people's health. And when people take inert capsules with nothing in them, but they're tricked into thinking that those capsules are beneficial, they receive actual physical changes in their body. There are physical changes that you would expect to occur from that compound, and there has been certain very clever studies that have been done where they've given people inert antidepressant drugs that have nothing in them. They've just been told that they're antidepressants, and those people actually have physical changes in their brain chemistry from that inert substance. In other words, the belief that something is going to help you is enough to actually cause the physical change in your mind, which will then cause you could quite easily improve your mood and have an antidepressant effects. And those effects, which are often recorded on things like MRI scans, actually are the effects that mirror those people that took active drugs such as fluoxetine and other drugs that act as antidepressants. In other words, it's possible to trick somebody into actually getting the same effect as an active pharmaceutical drug just by giving them an inert substance and telling them that that's what will happen. So if you take a particular herb, you take chamomile, it works for you and your anxiety is improved, it doesn't matter what papers have been done, it doesn't matter what anyone else says, that still worked. And even if it's not a real effect and there is no mechanism, the belief that that herb is working is enough to actually cause a real antidepressant or anxiolytic effect. So this is a really big field, and plants are very, very interesting, and really there are so many plants. When you look into the plant kingdom, there are many studies. The scientific literature is replete with these studies against certain plants, but when you actually look at the plants that have been screened and the plants that have been put through these studies, we're not even scratching the surface. Even if you look at the edible plants that are in the United Kingdom, the ones that have been assessed for anxiolytic effects are minute compared with the amount that haven't. There are many edible plants that people don't even consider herbs, and we don't use them in traditional medicine, yet you have a look at chemical composition of these plants and they have that same profile that you would expect to find in those anxiolytic herbs that we know about. So really what I'm saying is, I've talked about anxiolytic herbs, I've talked about how they work, but really what you can do is, if you are, pick a herb that you take, maybe as a tea, have a look in the scientific literature and see what it contains, see what type of chemicals. Generally, if the plant contains high amounts of flavonoids, if it's got high amounts of antioxidants, if it contains certain alkaloids which may have specific effects on the central nervous system, or if it contains terpenoids which are also able to interact with the central nervous system, containing those types of chemicals, the chances are there may be mood elevating effects. Certainly the ones to look for are the flavonoids and high antioxidant content. I personally believe that if a plant has a high antioxidant content and it's an edible plant, it will have a mood elevating effect if you have high levels of oxidative stress causing that mood depression. That's the way I see it, and plant diets with high amounts of antioxidants, supplements which contain antioxidants, they will all have this effect, because if it's oxidative stress is the key that causes the anxiety or the depression, clearly anything that is able to decrease that oxidative stress is going to have mood elevating effects. So plants are very interesting. I would encourage you to have a look in the literature at chemical composition studies that have been done. I will try and put an example of such a paper in the comments box below this video, so you can have a look at how these papers are put together. And really it's just a case of going to something like Google Scholar, putting the name, usually the Latin name of your plant, but sometimes you can get away with putting the English name, usually putting the Latin name of the plant into a search, putting anxiety or anxiolytic next to it, and seeing if that plant has been screened for anxiolytic effects. And that's a simple way of finding out if you can actually find your own anxiolytic herbs, which you may be taking anyway, but you just don't realize that they're having that effect. So there you go, that's what you can do. And as always, I'm trying to encourage you to go to the scientific literature, trying to encourage you to learn about nutrition and learn about what's in plants, because really the best nutritionist there is for yourself is yourself. You will always be your best nutritionist, because you'll be able to get direct feedback on what effects these plants are having on you. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.